The voice was tired. That was the first thing she noticed. Not afraid. Not excited. Just deeply, profoundly tired. The way a person sounds when they have said something many times before and are not sure it matters anymore. Mara, if you're hearing this, the array picked it up on schedule. That means the dispersion model worked, and the signal is intact. I need you to listen carefully, because I don't know how many more windows I have. She stopped the playback. She stood in the middle of the lab for a long time, not moving. Then she played it again. The voice was hers. Not a recording she recognized, not something she could explain away. It was her cadence, her particular way of landing on certain vowels, the small catch in her throat she'd had since a respiratory infection 3 years ago. It was her. Older, rougher around the edges, carrying something heavy that the younger version hadn't yet learned to carry. She listened to the full transmission 3 times before she could absorb what it was actually saying. The message was a warning, not about a discovery, not about a danger approaching from outside, about a specific error, one she was 11 days from making. The data she was preparing to publish contained a flaw she hadn't found yet, a contamination artifact in Array C's eastern sensor cluster, introduced during a maintenance cycle 6 months prior, that had been subtly inflating the signal amplitude across her entire dataset. The anomalies she believed she had confirmed weren't confirmed. They were real. The voice was insistent about that, strangely urgent, but her evidence wasn't clean enough to prove it. Not yet. She would publish anyway because the funding review was in 3 weeks and she was out of time. And she believed in the data the way you believe in something you have spent a decade of your life building. The paper would be dismantled within a month. A team in Leiden would identify the sensor artifact. There would be a formal correction, then a retraction. Her department head would call it an honest mistake in public and something worse in private. The station's funding review would go badly. The program, the only one on the planet actively monitoring this frequency range, would be shut down the following year. Someone else would pick up the signal 11 years later with better equipment and prove everything Mara had theorized. By then, she would be teaching undergraduate survey courses and not answering emails about her early work. The future version of herself had spent 11 years trying to send the message back. She had done it using the very anomaly Mara was studying, bent the signal, folded it through a property of deep space hydrogen dispersion that Mara hadn't theorized yet, but which the voice described in enough detail to reconstruct. It had taken 11 years because the physics required a specific alignment of conditions that only occurred on a cycle. She had been waiting for the window, practicing the message, hoping it landed on the right Tuesday. The implications arrived slowly, the way heavy things do. If Mara received the message, she would change her decision. If she changed her decision, the catastrophic outcome wouldn't happen. If it didn't happen, the future version of herself would never have had a reason to send the message. But the message had already arrived. It was sitting in her audio buffer, time-stamped, irrefutable. It had already happened. It was always going to happen. And it couldn't have happened unless it was always going to. She stood at the window and looked out at the arrays, silver and still in the moonlight. On the 10th day, she almost submitted the paper anyway. She had the document open. The submission portal was loaded. Her cursor hovered over the button for a long time while she told herself the things you tell yourself when you're about to do something you know is wrong. That the voice could have been fabricated, a hallucination produced by isolation and sleep debt, and too much time alone with the instruments. That she had checked Array C and found nothing. That the funding deadline was real, and the consequence of missing it was also real. Another kind of ruin, slower but no less certain. That the future was not fixed. That the message could be from a version of events that no longer applied. That she could be wrong about all of it, and the paper could be right. She sat there for a long time. The cursor blinked. Then she closed the window. On the 11th day, Mara did not submit the paper. She archived it, flagged it as preliminary, and booked a technician to inspect the eastern sensor cluster on Array C. She wrote 3 additional months of verification protocols into her research schedule. Her department head called to ask what had changed. She said she'd found a variable she hadn't accounted for, which was true in a way. There's a sound that does not belong to the universe. It arrived on Tuesday at 3:47 in the morning while the rest of the world was asleep. A repeating pattern, precise as a heartbeat, and the woman who heard it first would spend the next 6 days wishing she hadn't. Dr. Mara Voss had been alone at the Atacama station for 11 weeks, not alone in the way people romanticize. No starlit epiphanies, no quiet communion with the cosmos, alone in the way that erodes you, meals eaten standing over a sink, conversations held with instruments that didn't talk back. The nearest town was 4 hours south, and she hadn't made the drive in 3 weeks. There was always another dataset to process, always one more reason to stay. She was 34, originally from Bonn, and she had devoted the last decade of her life to a single question: whether the universe had anything left to say. Her work focused on anomalous hydrogen line emissions, subtle deviations in the 21-centimeter wavelength that most researchers dismissed as interference. Mara didn't dismiss things easily. It was, depending on who you asked, either her greatest strength or the reason her last relationship ended. The station was small. Two prefab modules bolted together at the hip, surrounded by antenna arrays that stretched out across the high desert like the ribs of something fossilized. At night, the sky above was almost violent in its clarity. She had stopped looking up. The signal came through on Array C. At first, she assumed it was a calibration glitch. The equipment was old, and the dry air played tricks on the sensors. She flagged it, set a secondary monitor, and went back to sleep. But when she woke 4 hours later, it was still there. Same frequency, same duration, same interval, every 43 minutes and 12 seconds without deviation. That kind of regularity doesn't exist in nature, not at that scale. She pulled the full spectrum analysis and felt something tighten in her chest. The signal wasn't broadband noise. It was narrow, almost impossibly narrow, centered at a frequency just shy of the hydrogen line, modulated in a pattern she didn't recognize but couldn't stop staring at. She ran it through the lab's filtering software. She ran it again. On the third pass, the pattern shifted slightly, just a fraction of a hertz, and her stomach dropped. Instrument drift. It could be instrument drift. The kind of thing that fools exhausted researchers into seeing structure where there is only noise. She called the antenna array technician in Santiago and described what she was seeing. He suggested solar interference. She told him the sun was on the wrong side of the planet. He told her to get some sleep. She didn't argue because she knew he wasn't entirely wrong. She had been awake for 31 hours. The edges of things were starting to feel unreliable. But she didn't sleep. She recalibrated Array C manually, cross-referenced it against Arrays A and B, and ran a full hardware diagnostic that took 4 hours and came back clean. The signal was still there. The equipment was fine, which meant the problem, or the miracle, was somewhere else entirely. By the second day, she had isolated the modulation pattern. It was structured, not mathematical in the way researchers always hoped for. No prime sequences, no Fibonacci spirals. It was something else, something closer to language. She told herself she was pattern matching on nothing, that the human brain is a machine for finding faces in clouds. She made coffee. She stared at the waveform. She told herself again. By the third day, she began to suspect it was exactly that. She worked backward through the waveform, stripping harmonics, correcting for interstellar dispersion. The process took 18 hours, spread across 2 sleepless nights, and beneath all of it, compressed and degraded but unmistakably there, was audio, human audio, a voice. Her hands were shaking when she pressed play, then she stopped it, sat back, breathed. She pressed play again. She never told anyone about the signal. She filed it under an internal case number, buried it in a subdirectory, and spent the next 11 years working quietly, carefully toward a model of hydrogen dispersion that no one had asked her to find, driven by the knowledge that at the end of it, if the physics worked out, there would be a window, a specific alignment of conditions, a Tuesday. She never knew if her message got through,